Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Not Horror. If you're ready for a story that'll give you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now, get cozy, relax, and let's begin today's spooky tale. It started with an unexplainable voicemail. On December 30th, Kara Johansson found herself exhausted after a long day at work. The holiday rush at the small town cafe where she worked part-time had worn her thin. She planned to spend New Year's Eve quietly with her family, as she had every year since she could remember. Her phone buzzed just as she was about to collapse onto the couch, and she almost ignored it. But something compelled her to check. It was a voicemail. "Don't go," said a voice that sounded eerily like her own. It was shaky, distorted, barely audible beneath static. "If you go to the party, it'll be the last thing you ever do." Then, a strange sound, like metal scraping on glass, cut through before the message abruptly ended. Kara's heart raced. The call was from her own number, and the timestamp read, December 31st of the following year. She replayed it several times, her hands trembling. Every detail was unmistakable. It was her voice, her number, and yet it made no sense. Shaking off her unease, Kara convinced herself it had to be a prank, maybe a glitch. But as the hours ticked by, she found it impossible to relax. The warning repeated itself in her head like a sinister mantra. Don't go to the party. The next morning, she decided not to tell anyone. Her family had been preparing for their annual New Year's Eve gathering, and she didn't want to sound paranoid. They'd brush it off as a bad joke or think she was overworked. Instead, she tried to go about her day as normally as possible. But small things began to feel off. It started with her reflection. When she glanced into the bathroom mirror while brushing her teeth, something about her reflection looked wrong. The movements were delayed, like a poorly synced video. She blinked rapidly and stepped back, her pulse quickening. Her reflection didn't step back immediately. It lingered a moment too long before mirroring her actions. Kara told herself it was her imagination. She avoided looking in mirrors for the rest of the day. At the party that evening, her unease only grew. Her parents had gone all out, stringing fairy lights across the living room and setting up a buffet of snacks and drinks. Friends and neighbors crowded into their small home, laughing and sharing stories. It should have been comforting, but Kara couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The first strange occurrence happened when her uncle Mark approached her. He held a glass of champagne, his face lit with his usual boisterous grin. But as he leaned closer to clink glasses with her, she noticed his reflection in the nearby window. It wasn't smiling. She stared, horrified, as the reflection turned its head toward her, its grin slowly widening into something unnatural. She blinked, and the image was gone. Her uncle was chatting with someone else now, oblivious to her panic. Kara's breathing quickened. She needed to leave, but the party was her family's tradition. Everyone would notice if she disappeared. She decided to stick close to her younger brother Ethan for the rest of the evening. By 11:30, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Guests were still chatting and laughing, but their movements seemed strange, like they were slightly out of sync. A guest would turn to speak to someone, only for their head to snap back a second later, correcting itself unnaturally. Shadows in the corners of the room stretched farther than they should have, and the music on the speakers warped, like it was playing underwater. Kara's stomach twisted. The voicemail's warning rang in her ears. Don't go. Ethan noticed her pale face. Are you okay? He asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. I need some air, Kara mumbled and hurried outside. The crisp night air did little to calm her. The neighborhood was unusually quiet for New Year's Eve. No distant laughter, no fireworks, only an oppressive silence. She walked to the edge of the driveway, trying to collect her thoughts. When she turned back toward the house, she froze. Through the front window, she saw her family and friends inside, their bodies stiff and motionless. They stood like mannequins, their heads tilted at odd angles. The lights flickered as the room seemed to stretch, the walls bending inward as if the house was alive. And then, one by one, the people inside turned their heads toward her, slowly, in unison. Her heart pounded. She stumbled backward, gasping as the front door creaked open. A figure stepped out, her own reflection. It moved smoothly, unnaturally, its face split by a smile that didn't belong to her. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Kara," it whispered, its voice echoing like the voicemail. "You shouldn't have come." She turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, the streets looping back on themselves, no matter which direction she chose. Behind her, she could hear faint footsteps, growing louder and faster. Finally, Kara tripped and fell, scraping her hands and knees on the asphalt. When she looked up, she was back at the house. The front door was open, spilling warm light onto the lawn. Her reflection stood there, waiting. "Time's up," it said, extending a hand toward her. Kara screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the reflection's impossibly wide grin as it pulled her into the darkness. When neighbors arrived the next morning, they found the house empty. There was no sign of Kara, her family, or any of the guests. The only clue was a voicemail left on a neighbor's phone, a distorted voice warning, "Don't go!" Brian Mitchell always loved the idea of New Year's resolutions. He wasn't the type to let another year slip by without trying to improve himself. Each January 1st, he crafted an ambitious list of goals designed to transform him into the man he always dreamed of being. Lose weight, rekindle old friendships, finally write that novel. Every year the list grew longer, and every year his enthusiasm dwindled by February. But this year was going to be different. On December 31st, Brian sat in his cramped apartment, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. He typed out his resolutions meticulously, his fingers trembling with excitement. This would be the year everything changed. He'd quit smoking, hit the gym, find a better job, and, most importantly, make himself someone worth remembering. "Be remembered forever," he muttered, typing the final item on his list. Satisfied, he closed the laptop and poured himself a glass of cheap champagne. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight. Outside, he could hear the muffled pops of early fireworks and the laughter of partygoers in the street. Brian raised his glass in a solitary toast. "To a better me," he said, downing the drink in one gulp. As the countdown began, a strange sensation washed over him. His chest tightened, his vision blurred, and a sharp pain shot through his temples. He stumbled toward the couch, clutching his head as the room seemed to spin around him. Just as the clock struck midnight, the pain vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. When he opened his eyes, everything looked the same. His cluttered apartment, the flickering light bulb in the kitchen, but something felt off. The air was heavy, charged, as though the universe had shifted ever so slightly. He shrugged it off and went to bed, chalking it up to too much champagne on an empty stomach. The next morning, Brian woke up with an unusual burst of energy. His body felt lighter, his mind sharper. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The pudgy, tired man he had been the night before was gone. In his place stood a leaner, more vibrant version of himself. His jawline was sharper, his eyes clearer, and his skin practically glowed. "What the hell?" he muttered, running his hands over his face. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely confident. He spent the day marveling at his transformation, certain he had somehow willed it into existence. Maybe his determination to stick to his resolutions was already paying off. But by evening, the unease began. It started with the phone call. "Brian," a familiar voice rasped on the other end. It sounded like his own, but hoarser, weaker. "You have to stop." "Who is this?" Brian demanded, his pulse quickening. "They're watching you," the voice said. "The keeper is watching." "Don't." The line went dead. Brian stared at his phone, his hands trembling. He tried calling the number back, but it wasn't in his call log. Shaking his head, he told himself it was just a prank. A weird one, sure, but nothing to lose sleep over. The next morning, things grew stranger. As he stepped into the shower, he felt a sudden, searing pain in his sides. Looking down, he saw deep red lines stretching across his ribs. They looked like scars, but he didn't remember getting injured. By the time he got out of the shower, the scars had vanished. That day at work, an old friend from college, Sarah, stopped by the coffee shop where he worked. He hadn't spoken to her in years, not since their messy fallout, but she greeted him warmly, as if nothing had happened. "I've been thinking about you," she said, her smile oddly stiff. "We should catch up." Brian agreed, but as she walked away, he felt a cold dread creep over him. Something about her wasn't right. Her movements were too smooth, her laughter too hollow. Over the next week, Brian's resolutions continued to come true in ways he couldn't explain. His boss suddenly offered him a promotion. Strangers on the street treated him like a celebrity. But with every success came a creeping sense of dread. The scars reappeared, multiplying. His dreams were filled with shadowy figures watching him from the corners of his mind, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. On January 15th, he woke to find his reflection staring back at him with a grin that wasn't his own. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, his voice cracking. That night, the keeper came. It appeared as a tall, featureless figure cloaked in darkness. Its voice was a low hum that resonated deep in his bones. "You asked to be remembered," it said. "You asked for change." "I didn't ask for this," Brian screamed. "You asked for everything," the keeper replied, "and everything comes with a price." Brian fell to his knees, begging for mercy. The keeper extended a long, spindly hand, placing it on his chest. Pain shot through him as memories flooded his mind. Visions of the people he had hurt, the lives he had taken for granted. "You are not the first," the keeper said. "You will not be the last." Brian awoke in his bed the next morning, but he wasn't the same. His scars were gone, his body restored to its former glory, but something inside him was missing, a piece of his soul, perhaps, or his humanity. He deleted his resolution list, swearing never to make another one. But every New Year's Eve, the keeper's shadow lingered, waiting. Brian knew it was only a matter of time before it came to collect the rest. Jonah Dawson was 10 years old the first time he heard the whispers. It was New Year's Eve, and the small town of Willowbrook was blanketed in snow. His parents were hosting a party downstairs, filling the house with laughter, clinking glasses, and the crackle of a warm fire. Jonah had begged to stay up until midnight, but his mother insisted he go to bed after dinner. As he lay under his covers, staring at the glowing constellations of his ceiling stickers, he heard it, a faint, desperate whisper carried on the cold wind. "Help me!" Jonah bolted upright in bed, his heart racing. He looked around the dark room, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. He thought he must have imagined it until he heard it again, louder this time. "Help me, please." The voice was soft and pleading, coming from just outside his window. His bedroom was on the second floor, and the thought of someone being up there sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, he crept out of bed and approached the frosted glass. At first, he saw nothing but his own reflection and the snow falling in the dim orange glow of the street lamp. Then, something moved, a small shadow darting across the yard below. It was quick, almost too quick to see, but it was enough to make Jonah stumble back from the window. He ran to his bed, pulled the covers over his head, and squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't sleep at all that night, and by morning, he convinced himself it had been a bad dream. The whispers came back the next year. This time, Jonah was 11 and determined not to be scared. When the soft, pleading voice called to him from the window, he grabbed his flashlight and tiptoed to the glass. He pressed his face close, trying to peer into the darkness. "Who's there?" he whispered. For a moment, there was silence. Then the voice responded, faint and trembling. "They won't let me leave." The words sent a shiver through Jonah. He couldn't see anyone outside, but the voice sounded like it belonged to a child. He opened the window a crack, letting in a blast of icy air. "Who won't let you leave?" he asked. "The bad ones," the voice replied, and before Jonah could ask more, a sharp, angry noise, like nails scraping against metal, cut through the silence. He slammed the window shut, his hands shaking. The next morning, Jonah tried to tell his parents, but they dismissed it as a wild imagination. His mother ruffled his hair and laughed. "You've been watching too many spooky cartoons," she said, but Jonah knew it wasn't his imagination. The whispers became an annual occurrence, haunting him every New Year's Eve. As he grew older, the voice became clearer, the pleas more desperate. By the time he turned 15, he could make out more details. The voice belonged to a girl, and she was trapped somewhere outside his home. He tried everything to help her. He left his window open one year, hoping she would come inside. Another year, he left flashlights and blankets on the lawn. Nothing worked. Each time the whispers would fade away as the clock struck midnight, leaving Jonah feeling helpless and confused. When Jonah turned 18, he decided enough was enough. It was the last New Year's Eve he would spend in Willowbrook before heading off to college, and he was determined to get to the bottom of the whispers. That night, as the party raged downstairs, Jonah prepared for the moment he knew would come. He dressed warmly, grabbed a flashlight, and waited by the window. When the voice finally came, soft, trembling, and so close it felt like it was inside the room, he didn't hesitate. "Help me, please," the voice whispered. Jonah threw open the window and climbed out onto the roof. The snow was thick and slippery beneath his boots, but he steadied himself and shone his flashlight across the yard. "Where are you?" he called. "Here," the voice answered, leading him toward the edge of the roof. He leaned over, his breath clouding in the icy air. That's when he saw her. She was standing in the snow, her pale face illuminated by the flashlight. Her hair was dark and matted, her clothes torn and soaked through. She couldn't have been older than 10, but her eyes were empty, like glass. "Who are you?" Jonah asked, his voice trembling. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the woods at the edge of the property. "They're in there," she said, "the bad ones." Jonah felt a chill run down his spine. The woods had always been a source of town legends, stories of disappearances, strange lights, and voices that called to people in the night. He hesitated, but the girl's pleading eyes pushed him forward. He climbed down from the roof and crossed the snow-covered yard, the girl leading him toward the woods. As they walked, Jonah realized something unsettling. Her footprints weren't leaving any marks in the snow. He stopped. "Wait," he said. "Who are you, really?" The girl turned to face him, her expression somber. "I was like you once," she said. "I tried to help, too. But now I'm stuck here." Before Jonah could respond, a low growl echoed from the trees ahead. The girl's face twisted in fear. "Run," she whispered. "They're coming." Jonah barely had time to react before dark, shadowy figures emerged from the woods. Their forms were humanoid but distorted, their faces featureless except for glowing red eyes. They moved unnaturally fast, their limbs bending at impossible angles. Jonah turned and ran, his heart pounding. The girl's screams echoed behind him, mingling with the guttural growls of the creatures. He sprinted back toward the house, the shadows gaining on him with every step. When he finally reached his window, he scrambled inside and slammed it shut. The creatures stopped just outside, their glowing eyes fixed on him. They didn't try to enter. They only stared. And then, as the clock struck midnight, they vanished. Jonah never heard the whispers again after that night, but every New Year's Eve, he dreamed of the girl standing in the snow, her empty eyes pleading for help. And in those dreams, the shadows were always waiting. It was supposed to be the event of the year. Every New Year's Eve, the Hensley Manor on the outskirts of town hosted an extravagant masquerade ball. Tickets were nearly impossible to come by, reserved for the wealthy, the influential, and those lucky enough to know someone on the inside. For years, Lily had heard whispers about the event, how it transformed into something magical, almost otherworldly, when the clock struck midnight. This year, against all odds, she received an invitation. The envelope arrived at her tiny apartment on December 27th, slipped under her door with no return address. Inside was a single gold-embossed card that read, "You are cordially invited to the Midnight Masquerade. Hensley Manor, December 31st. Formal attire required. A mask is mandatory." The card was unsigned, and there was no indication of who had sent it. At first, Lily thought it might have been a mistake. She wasn't rich, didn't have connections, and had no idea why she would be invited to such an exclusive event. But curiosity gnawed at her. She convinced herself it was fate, an opportunity she couldn't pass up. On the evening of December 31st, she dressed in her finest gown, a vintage piece she'd found at a thrift store, and a delicate silver mask that framed her dark eyes. As she approached Hensley Manor, the grand building loomed like a dark shadow against the snowy landscape. Its Gothic spires and ornate windows seemed to watch her as she made her way up the stone steps. The massive oak doors creaked open before she could knock, revealing a butler dressed in a black suit. He nodded silently, gesturing for her to enter. The air inside was heavy with the scent of wax candles and aged wood, and the distant hum of music echoed through the grand halls. The ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the marble floors, and the guests, dressed in lavish gowns and tailored suits, moved like a sea of color, their masks glittering in the light. The music was enchanting, a haunting melody played by a string quartet in the corner. Lily felt out of place among the glamorous crowd, but no one seemed to notice her discomfort. Instead, they greeted her warmly, their voices muffled by their masks. She couldn't help but feel a strange tension in the air, as though everyone was waiting for something. As the night progressed, Lily began to notice odd details. The clocks around the room were frozen at 11:50, their hands refusing to move. Guests whispered to each other in hushed tones, their conversations ceasing abruptly whenever she approached. And yet, despite her growing unease, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Something about the atmosphere held her captive, as if she were caught in a dream she couldn't wake from. At 5 minutes to midnight, the music stopped abruptly. The butler appeared in the center of the room, holding a silver tray with a single glass of champagne. The crowd parted as he approached Lily, his expression unreadable. "This is for you," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Lily hesitated, glancing around the room. Every masked face was turned toward her, their eyes glinting with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She took the glass reluctantly, the cool stem trembling in her hand. "To our guest of honor," the butler said, raising his hand. The crowd echoed his sentiment, lifting their own glasses in unison. Before she could ask what was happening, the clock struck midnight. A deafening chime rang through the ballroom, and the lights flickered violently. The room grew colder, and the guests' masks seemed to shift, their intricate designs twisting into grotesque shapes. Lily stumbled back, the champagne glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. The music resumed, but it was no longer beautiful. The haunting melody had turned into a discordant wail, and the guests began to move in ways that defied logic. Their limbs bent unnaturally, their movements jerky and chaotic. Lily's heart raced as she backed away, only to find herself surrounded. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice trembling. One of the guests stepped forward, their mask now resembling a snarling beast. "You've been chosen," they said, their voice distorted and inhuman. "Chosen for what?" Lily whispered, her throat dry. "For the dance," another guest replied, their laughter echoing like a broken record. Before she could react, they grabbed her arms and pulled her toward the center of the room. The crowd closed in around her, their twisted masks and elongated limbs creating a dizzying wall of terror. The butler appeared again, holding a golden mask unlike any she'd seen before. "This will complete you," he said, forcing the mask onto her face. The moment it touched her skin, pain shot through her head like 1,000 needles. The mask fused to her, its edges sinking into her flesh. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the guests' cheers. Her vision blurred, and when it cleared, she saw herself in one of the ballroom's gilded mirrors. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her own. The mask had transformed her, its grotesque design now part of her face. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her movements felt foreign, as though she were a puppet on invisible strings. "Welcome to eternity," the butler said, bowing slightly. The music swelled, and the guests began to dance once more, their distorted forms spinning and writhing in a macabre waltz. Lily was pulled into their midst, her body moving against her will. No matter how hard she tried to scream, her voice was gone. As the night stretched on, she realized the horrifying truth. She was no longer a guest. She was part of the masquerade now, trapped in an endless midnight where time stood still. Outside, the first rays of dawn touched the snow-covered grounds of Hensley Manor. The ballroom was silent, empty, and lifeless. The only sound was the faint, haunting echo of music, carried on the wind to the next unlucky soul destined to receive an invitation. Sam had never liked mirrors. There was something unnerving about them. The way they reflected reality, yet somehow felt separate, as if they belonged to another world. Growing up, he avoided them whenever possible, preferring to rely on the vague outlines of his reflection in windows or the surface of a still lake. But on New Year's Eve, a strange set of circumstances forced him to confront his lifelong fear. He had just moved into a small, run-down apartment after a messy breakup, desperate for a fresh start. The place was old and drafty, with creaking floors and peeling wallpaper. But it was cheap, and that was all that mattered. It came furnished with mismatched furniture, including an antique mirror hanging in the hallway. The mirror was tall and ornate, its gold frame covered in intricate carvings of ivy and flowers. The glass was cloudy, the kind that seemed to blur details and deepen shadows. Sam hated it from the moment he moved in, but he convinced himself he was being irrational. It was just a mirror, after all. On December 31st, he decided to stay in. He wasn't in the mood for parties or celebrations, still reeling from the breakup and the loneliness that followed. As the evening stretched on, he sat in his living room, nursing a beer and scrolling aimlessly on his phone. At 11:45 p.m., the power went out. The sudden darkness was jarring, and Sam cursed under his breath as he fumbled for his flashlight. The apartment was eerily silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He pointed the beam of the flashlight toward the hallway and froze. The mirror was glowing faintly. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he approached, the glow grew brighter. It was coming from deep within the glass, a soft, silvery shimmer that seemed to ripple like water. "What the hell?" Sam muttered, his pulse quickening. He reached out and touched the surface of the mirror. It was cold, almost icy, but it didn't feel solid. His fingers sank into it as though it were a liquid. He yanked his hand back, heart pounding. A voice echoed from the mirror. "Do you want to play a game?" Sam stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The voice was soft, almost playful, but there was an edge to it that made his skin crawl. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaky. The glow in the mirror intensified, and a figure began to take shape. It was his reflection, but it wasn't him. The figure moved differently, its gestures too smooth, its smile too wide. "I've been watching you," the reflection said. "You're lonely, aren't you?" Sam's mouth went dry. "What do you want?" The reflection tilted its head, its smile widening. "A simple game. If you win, you get a wish, anything you desire. If you lose..." It didn't finish the sentence, but the way its smile faltered made Sam's stomach churn. "I'm not playing," Sam said, stepping back. The reflection laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the small hallway. "You don't have a choice, Sam. The game has already begun." Before he could react, the glass rippled violently, and the reflection reached out, grabbing his wrist. The coldness of its touch burned like frostbite, and Sam cried out as he was yanked forward into the mirror. He landed hard on the floor, the air knocked out of his lungs. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his apartment. He was in a vast, shadowy void, the ground beneath him smooth and reflective, like the surface of a lake. Around him, countless mirrors floated in the darkness, each one showing a different version of himself. Some looked normal, but others were twisted, their faces distorted by rage, fear, or anguish. The reflection stood before him, now fully formed and separate from the glass. It looked identical to him, but its eyes were darker, its smile sharper. "The rules are simple," it said. "Find the real you before the clock strikes midnight. But beware," it gestured to the mirrors. "Not all of them are friendly." Sam's heart raced as he looked around. He could hear faint whispers coming from the mirrors, each one calling to him in his own voice. The clock in the distance struck 11:50, its chime echoing ominously. "Go," the reflection said, disappearing into the void. Sam ran to the nearest mirror, peering into its surface. His reflection stared back at him, its expression blank. He touched the glass, but it didn't feel right. Too cold, too hollow. He backed away, shaking his head. The next mirror was worse. His reflection grinned at him, its eyes gleaming with malice. When he reached out, it slammed its hands against the glass, cracking it from the inside. Sam stumbled back, the cracks spreading like spiderwebs until the mirror shattered completely. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Over here," one voice called. "No, this way," said another. Every mirror seemed to demand his attention, their reflections growing more grotesque with each passing moment. One showed him gaunt and lifeless, his eyes sunken and his skin gray. Another showed him drowning in darkness, clawing at the surface as if begging for help. The clock struck 11:55. Panic set in as he darted from mirror to mirror, searching for something, anything, that felt real. But with each failed attempt, the void grew colder, the whispers louder. "Time is running out," the reflection's voice taunted, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. Finally, he found a mirror that felt different. The reflection stared back at him, but its eyes were filled with fear, just like his own. It looked just as desperate to escape as he felt. "Is it you?" Sam whispered, his hand trembling as he reached out. The reflection nodded, mimicking his movements perfectly. The clock struck 11:59. With no other options, Sam pressed his hand to the glass. It was warm this time, almost comforting. The surface rippled, and he felt himself being pulled forward, back into his apartment. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor of his hallway. The mirror was gone, replaced by an empty frame. The power was back, and the clock on the wall struck midnight. For a moment, he felt relief. He had won. But then he noticed the reflection in the window. It smiled at him, a sharp, twisted smile that wasn't his own, and from the glass, a familiar voice whispered, "Better luck next time." The little town of Black Hollow was known for its peculiar traditions, and none was more peculiar than the Lantern Walk on New Year's Eve. Every year, as the final hours of December ticked away, the townspeople would gather at the edge of the forest with lanterns in hand. They would light their candles, form a line, and walk the winding path into the trees. No one spoke during the walk, and no one ever explained its purpose to outsiders. It was simply done. When Mia moved to Black Hollow for her new teaching job, she found the tradition equal parts fascinating and unsettling. Her colleagues spoke of it with quiet reverence, their expressions growing serious whenever she asked questions. "It's just something we do," one of them said. "But why?" Mia pressed. "What's the point?" "Respect the tradition," they replied, avoiding her gaze. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, Mia's curiosity had reached its peak. She decided she would join the Lantern Walk and see for herself what the fuss was about. At precisely 11 p.m., she joined the gathering crowd at the forest's edge. The townspeople were eerily silent, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames of their lanterns. Mia noticed that everyone, regardless of age, carried an air of solemnity. She had brought her own lantern, a small metal thing she'd found at a local antique shop, and lit its candle with shaking hands. The cold wind bit at her cheeks as she fell into line behind an elderly woman who gave her a fleeting glance. The walk began. The forest path was narrow, twisting through dense trees that seemed to lean in close, their bare branches forming an arch overhead. The only sounds were the crunch of snow underfoot and the soft rustling of the wind. The golden glow of the lanterns stretched out ahead and behind Mia, a fragile chain of light in the darkness. As they walked deeper into the woods, an oppressive silence settled over the group. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but all she could see were more lanterns bobbing in the distance. The path led to a clearing. In the center stood a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled roots twisting like the fingers of a giant. At its base was a stone altar, weathered and cracked, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the lantern light. The townspeople formed a circle around the tree, their lanterns held high. Mia followed their lead, her breath fogging in the icy air. Then, one by one, the townspeople began to extinguish their lanterns. Mia hesitated, her pulse quickening as the clearing grew darker. She noticed the elderly woman in front of her, giving her a stern look, motioning for her to do the same. Reluctantly, Mia blew out her candle. Darkness swallowed the clearing, leaving only the faint outline of the tree and the altar. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, The air grew colder, and an unnatural hush fell over the forest. Mia felt the ground beneath her feet tremble as a faint, eerie glow began to emanate from the altar. Whispers filled the air, soft, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. The glow from the altar grew brighter, and shadows began to move among the trees, shapes too distorted and unnatural to belong to any human or animal. Mia's chest tightened with fear. She turned to leave, but the townspeople stood motionless, their faces devoid of expression as they stared at the altar. "What's happening?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The elderly woman turned to her, her face pale and tight with fear. "Do not run," she whispered. "It will notice." Before Mia could ask what she meant, a figure emerged from the altar's glow. It was tall and thin, its body wrapped in tattered robes that seemed to flow like smoke. Its face was obscured by a mask carved from bone, its hollow eyes radiating an unnatural light. It moved with a grace that was both mesmerizing and horrifying, its elongated fingers trailing through the air as it stepped forward. The whispers grew louder, and the townspeople fell to their knees. Mia stood frozen, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The figure stopped in front of her, tilting its head as if studying her. Then it reached out, its hand hovering just above her chest. The cold emanating from it was unbearable, sinking deep into her bones. "You are not one of them," the figure said, its voice echoing as though coming from a great distance. Mia's throat tightened. I'm new," she stammered. The figure leaned closer, its presence suffocating. "A trespasser," it said, its tone devoid of emotion. Before Mia could respond, the elderly woman spoke. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. She didn't know. "Spare her." The figure turned its glowing eyes toward the woman, studying her for a long, agonizing moment. Then it stepped back, raising one skeletal hand. The whispers ceased, and the glow from the altar began to fade. "Leave," it said. The townspeople rose to their feet and began to walk back toward the path, their movements stiff and mechanical. Mia followed, her heart racing as she clutched her extinguished lantern. When they reached the edge of the forest, the townspeople dispersed silently, returning to their homes as if nothing had happened. Mia stood in the snow, her breath coming in shaky gasps. The elderly woman approached her, her expression grave. "You're lucky," she said. "It doesn't always show mercy." "What was that?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. The woman's gaze hardened. "The keeper," she said. "It ensures the balance between us and the forest. The lantern walk is our offering, our way of showing respect. If you don't—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Mia returned to her apartment that night, unable to shake the image of the figure from her mind. She stayed up until dawn, her lantern clutched tightly in her hands. She never joined the lantern walk again, but every New Year's Eve as midnight approached, she would see the faint glow of lanterns in the woods, and she would remember the bone mask, the hollow eyes, and the voice that echoed with ancient power. Mia had been spared once. She wasn't sure she'd be so lucky again. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of civilization. Emma had rented it for a solitary New Year's retreat, hoping to escape the noise and chaos of the city. She wanted silence, a chance to reflect on the past year and start fresh. It was her first mistake. The snow began falling heavily just as she arrived. By the time she unloaded her bags and started a fire, the storm had turned the world outside into a white blur. The silence she craved was immediate and absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the cabin's old wooden beams. The first sign that something was wrong came that evening, as she prepared dinner. She was slicing vegetables at the kitchen counter when she heard a soft knock at the window. She froze, the knife still in her hand. Slowly, she turned her head, her heart pounding. The window was frosted over, but she could make out the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. She approached cautiously, her breath fogging up the cold air around her. But when she wiped the frost away, there was nothing there, just the swirling snow beyond the window pane. She told herself it was the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But deep down, she didn't believe it. That night, Emma struggled to sleep. She lay in the small bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the storm outside like a constant whisper. Every so often, she thought she heard something else, footsteps crunching in the snow, faint and far away. At one point, she sat up, her skin crawling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely louder than a whisper. The only response was the wind howling through the trees. Finally, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted off into a restless sleep. She woke with a start hours later, her heart racing. The room was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers in the hearth. She didn't know what had woken her, but as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she realized she wasn't alone. There was a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadows. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for the bedside lamp, but by the time she turned it on, the figure was gone. The room was empty. She told herself it was a dream, a trick of the light, but her gut told her otherwise. The next morning, she found tracks in the snow outside the cabin. They were large and deep, leading from the woods to her window and then back again. Emma's stomach churned as she crouched to examine them. The prints didn't look quite human, too wide, with long, claw-like indentations at the tips. She followed them as far as she dared, but they disappeared into the dense forest. She considered leaving, but the snow was too deep and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Her car, parked at the end of the long, unplowed driveway, was completely buried, so she stayed. That night, the knocking returned. It was louder this time, more insistent, coming from every window at once. Emma sat in the middle of the living room, clutching the fireplace poker like a lifeline. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The knocking stopped, but then she heard it, a voice faint and muffled calling her name. "Emma!" She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar. It sounded like her sister, Lily. But that was impossible. Lily had died in a car accident 5 years ago. "Emma, let me in." Tears pricked her eyes as she stumbled to her feet, moving toward the door. She stopped herself just short of reaching for the handle. "It's not her," she whispered, shaking her head. "It can't be her." But the voice grew louder, more desperate. "Emma, please. It's so cold out here." Her hand hovered over the lock, trembling. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to see her sister again. But something in her gut screamed at her to stop. "Go away!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "You're not her!" The voice fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then came a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls of the cabin. Emma backed away from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She heard something heavy move across the porch, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the wood. The next morning, the storm finally passed. The sun rose over a pristine, snow-covered landscape, but Emma found no comfort in its light. Outside, the porch was littered with deep, clawed gouges in the wood. The tracks in the snow circled the cabin, as if whatever had been out there had spent the entire night prowling around. Emma didn't hesitate this time. She packed her things and dug her car out as quickly as she could, her hands trembling with every shovelful of snow. By the time she pulled onto the road, her breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw something standing at the edge of the woods, a tall, dark figure watching her. But when she blinked, it was gone. Emma never returned to the cabin, and she never told anyone what had happened. But every year on New Year's Eve, as the snow falls and the wind howls, she hears the faint echo of a voice in her dreams. Emma. It all started with a dare. On New Year's Eve, Nathan, Clara, and Marcus sat huddled in the living room of Clara's grandmother's old, creaky house. The place had an air of neglect, dusty furniture, faded wallpaper, and a grandfather clock that ticked ominously in the corner. "All right, let's make this year interesting," Clara said, her eyes gleaming with mischief as she poured another glass of wine. "Let's each make a resolution, but with a twist." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A twist?" Clara grinned. "We have to write our resolutions on paper, fold them up, and place them in the resolution jar." She held up an old, ornate jar with intricate carvings that she'd found in the attic earlier that day. "Then we draw them at random. Whatever you pick, you have to do it. That sounds like a terrible idea, Nathan said, though he couldn't help but laugh. Come on, it's tradition, Clara insisted. My grandma used to do this with her friends. They said it was fun. Nathan and Marcus exchanged skeptical glances, but eventually relented. They each scribbled a resolution on a scrap of paper, folded it tightly, and dropped it into the jar. All right, Clara said, giving the jar a shake. Who's first? Marcus reached in, pulling out a slip of paper. He unfolded it and read aloud, I resolve to quit my job and pursue my dream. He laughed nervously. Guess I'll be sending in my resignation next week. Clara went next. She unfolded her paper and grinned. I resolved to finally ask out my crush. Nathan hesitated as he reached into the jar. There was something unsettling about the way the room had grown quieter, the shadows stretching across the walls as the grandfather clock ticked closer to midnight. He pulled out a slip of paper and read it aloud. I resolved to survive. The room fell silent. Clara frowned. Who wrote that? Nathan looked up, his face pale. Not me. Not me either, Marcus said, his voice uneasy. Clara shook her head. I didn't write it. They stared at the jar, the atmosphere in the room growing heavier. The air seemed colder now, the light from the fire dimmer. That's not funny, Nathan said, his voice shaking. Which one of you did it? I swear I didn't, Clara said, her expression serious. Neither did I, Marcus insisted. Before Nathan could respond, the clock struck midnight. The chime echoed through the house, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. Then the lights went out. Damn it, Clara muttered, fumbling for her phone. The power must have gone out. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. Something about the darkness felt wrong, oppressive, as if the shadows were alive. I'll get some candles, Claire said, using the flashlight on her phone to guide her to the kitchen. Don't split up, Nathan said, his voice trembling. Oh, come on, Nathan, it's just a power outage, Claire said, disappearing down the hallway. Marcus sat frozen on the couch, his eyes darting around the room. This doesn't feel right, man, he whispered. Nathan nodded, his grip tightening on the edge of the coffee table. I know. A sound came from the hallway, a low, guttural growl. Clara, Marcus called out. There was no response. Stay here, Nathan said, standing up. Marcus grabbed his arm. Are you insane? Don't go out there. We can't just sit here, Nathan said, pulling away. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The air felt colder here, and the growl echoed again, louder this time. Nathan's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move at the end of the hall. Clara, he called out, his voice shaking. He found her in the kitchen, standing perfectly still, her back to him. Clara? She didn't respond. Nathan reached out to touch her shoulder, but the moment his fingers brushed her skin, she turned around sharply. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, her face pale and twisted in terror. They're coming, she whispered. What? Nathan asked, his stomach dropping. Before she could answer, the growl returned, reverberating through the house. It was closer now, almost as if it were coming from inside the walls. Nathan grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her back toward the living room. We need to get out of here, he said. Marcus was already on his feet, his face ashen. What's going on? I don't know, but we're leaving, Nathan said. They headed for the front door, but as Nathan reached for the handle, the growling erupted into a deafening roar. The door slammed shut on its own, the lock twisting with a metallic click. What the hell? Marcus shouted, pulling at the door. It wouldn't budge. The shadows in the room began to move, stretching across the walls and ceiling. Shapes formed within them, twisted monstrous figures with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp teeth. They're here, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. Nathan felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Run, he shouted. The three of them bolted for the stairs, the shadows surging after them like a living tide. They reached the second floor and slammed the door to one of the bedrooms behind them, barricading it with a dresser. What is happening? Marcus gasped, his chest heaving. Nathan's mind raced. The words from the resolution jar echoed in his head. I resolved to survive. This is my fault, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? Clara asked. The resolution, it wasn't a joke. It's real. And whatever's out there, it's not going to stop until one of us is dead. The growling returned, louder and more insistent, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against the door. Then we fight, Marcus said, grabbing a broken chair leg. Nathan nodded, his resolve hardening. Together. The battle that followed was a blur of chaos and terror. The shadows broke through the barricade, their monstrous forms twisting and writhing as they filled the room. Nathan swung wildly, his makeshift weapon passing through the creatures like smoke. Clara screamed as one of the figures lunged at her, its claws raking across her arm. Marcus tackled it, his own scream of defiance drowned out by the deafening roars. Nathan realized they couldn't win. The creatures were endless, relentless. In a moment of desperation, he grabbed the resolution jar, still clutched in Clara's hands. "What are you doing?" she cried. Nathan didn't answer. He smashed the jar against the floor, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The shadows froze, their movements halting as if caught in an invisible force. Then, one by one, they dissolved, their forms dissipating into the air. The room fell silent. By morning, the three of them sat in the living room, exhausted and bloodied but alive. The house was quiet now, the air still and cold. Nathan stared at the shards of the resolution jar, a deep sense of unease settling over him. "It's over," Marcus said, his voice hollow. Nathan wasn't so sure. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the windows, he noticed something etched into the floor where the jar had shattered. A single word: soon. There was something inherently unsettling about the old clock. Abby had always known it, but she never could put her finger on why. The grandfather clock in the corner of her grandmother's house had always been present, ticking away with an eerie precision. It was a relic of the past, a piece of the house's history that seemed out of place in a world that had moved on. Abby had spent every New Year's Eve at her grandmother's house as a child, and the clock had always been there, looming in the background. But this year, for the first time since her grandmother's passing, Abby was spending the holiday alone. The house, which had once been full of warmth and love, felt cold now. The fireplace crackled in the living room, but no amount of fire could chase away the chill that clung to the walls. Abby had never felt so isolated. It was just after midnight when she heard it, the chime of the clock. "Strange," Abby muttered, glancing at the clock. The hands were still at midnight, but the chime had come anyway, echoing through the empty house. The sound seemed to reverberate through her bones, setting her teeth on edge. She shook her head, dismissing it as some trick of her mind, but the sensation of unease lingered. Abby turned her attention to the clock again, watching the second hand tick relentlessly forward. That's when she noticed it. The time was moving faster. The second hand was jumping ahead in irregular intervals, skipping minutes, seconds, and hours, until it was no longer moving at all. The clock was frozen at midnight. Abby's heart began to race. She felt her stomach twist, a sense of foreboding settling deep within her. She had to get away from it, but something kept her rooted to the spot, her eyes drawn back to the timepiece. The tick-tock, once steady, now sounded slower, deeper, almost like it was breathing. Abby stood in a trance as the hands began to move again, but this time they moved backward. Slowly at first, then faster. Tick, tick, tick. The chimes rang again, louder this time, and Abby's breath hitched as the hands of the clock moved in rapid succession, faster and faster, until it sounded as if time itself was unraveling. The lights flickered, and the room seemed to darken, as though the house was being swallowed by the night. "No, this isn't real," Abby whispered to herself, shaking her head. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the clock. The air around her felt heavy, thick with an oppressive force she couldn't understand. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, as though reaching out for her. A sound, a scraping, dragging noise, suddenly broke the silence, and Abby's heart skipped a beat. She turned around, her pulse hammering in her ears. From the corner of the room, the grandfather clock had begun to creak and groan, as if it were coming to life. And then, to Abby's horror, something began to emerge from the darkness of the clock. A figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch out of the shadows like tendrils. The figure's face was obscured by a dark hood, its features hidden in the folds of the fabric. Abby could feel its gaze on her, even though she couldn't see its eyes. It was like it was studying her, waiting for something. The air turned cold. Abby felt it creeping up her spine, like ice crawling beneath her skin. "You shouldn't have come back," a low, rasping voice whispered from the figure. Abby backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What are you?" The figure stepped forward, and as it did, Abby felt the temperature drop even further. The room was freezing now, the cold so intense it hurt to breathe. "The clock is not just a keeper of time," the figure rasped. "It is the keeper of the dead. The moments you've forgotten, the moments you've lost, they all collect here, waiting to be claimed." Abby's heart hammered in her chest. "I don't understand." "Time is not a gift, girl. It is a curse," the figure continued, its voice like dry leaves scratching against the earth. "And tonight, the clock strikes dread." With a sudden motion, the figure reached out and grabbed the edge of the clock, pulling it toward itself. The hand spun wildly, faster than Abby could comprehend, as the room seemed to warp and bend around her. The clock's chimes echoed louder and louder, growing deafening as the air became thick with an unnatural pressure. Abby stumbled backward, her vision blurring. The shadows seemed to close in on her, suffocating her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was as though time itself was collapsing around her. And then, with a sudden deafening crash, everything stopped. The clock fell silent. The figure was gone. The room was still. Abby was on the floor, her heart racing, gasping for air. She looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The clock was frozen again, its hands still at midnight. The house was quiet, but Abby knew something had changed. The feeling of dread that had settled over her was not gone. It lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. Her eyes went to the clock once more. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, she could have sworn she saw something in the reflection of the glass. A face. A pale, distorted face with hollow eyes staring back at her. Abby didn't wait to see more. She ran. The rest of the night was a blur. Abby couldn't remember exactly how she managed to leave the house, but by morning, she found herself standing outside in the cold, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The house loomed behind her, silent and still, but Abby knew she would never forget what she had seen. The clock, and the thing that had emerged from it, had claimed its toll. And with every passing year, as the hands of the clock ticked forward into the new year, she could feel the darkness growing. The clock was still there, waiting, watching, and it would strike again. The New Year's Eve party at the old farmhouse had been a tradition for as long as Chloe could remember. Every year, her family gathered at her grandparents' house, a rambling, weathered building at the edge of town, to celebrate the end of one year and the beginning of the next. But this year, something felt different. The house, once filled with laughter and the sound of clinking glasses, was eerily quiet. The once vibrant decorations had begun to fade, and the once glistening windows were now coated with a thick layer of dust. Chloe stood in the entryway, the cold air biting at her cheeks as she glanced around the dimly lit space. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt forgotten. Her grandmother had passed away 2 years ago, and her grandfather had gone into a nursing home shortly after. The house had been left abandoned ever since. But this year, Chloe and her cousins had decided to come back, to honor the old traditions. The party started as usual, with everyone mingling around the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and the drinks. But as midnight approached, Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a strange heaviness in the air, something she couldn't quite explain. As the clock ticked down to the final seconds of the year, the mood shifted. The lights flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and the chatter around the room faded. Everyone gathered around the windows, eagerly waiting for the fireworks that would mark the beginning of a new year. But when the clock struck 12, nothing happened. There were no fireworks, no explosion of color in the sky, only silence. Chloe turned to her cousin Ben, who was standing beside her. "Where are the fireworks?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. Ben shrugged, his face pale. "I thought we'd set them up earlier. Maybe something went wrong with the fuse." but Chloe couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside her. It wasn't like Ben to forget something as important as the fireworks, and there was no way they could have miscalculated the time. That's when she saw it. From the corner of the room, in the dim light of the hallway, something flickered, like a spark. At first, Chloe thought it was just a trick of the light, but then the spark grew brighter, and she realized it was coming from the forgotten attic above the house. Without thinking, Chloe moved toward the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know why she felt the need to investigate. It was as though some force beyond her control was pulling her toward the attic. The others were too distracted, still talking about the fireworks and the strange silence that had fallen over the night. But Chloe's feet moved faster, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as she ascended the creaking staircase. The attic door was slightly ajar, and Chloe hesitated before pushing it open. The smell of dust and old wood hit her instantly. The space was barely lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Old furniture was scattered around: chairs, a tarnished mirror, and a dusty chest covered in cobwebs. But there, in the corner, sat an old wooden crate. It was unmarked, the wood stained with age, and there were strange markings carved into its sides, symbols she didn't recognize. And then Chloe saw them. Fireworks. Hundreds of fireworks, stacked haphazardly inside the crate. They looked ancient, their shells cracked and faded. But the thing that unsettled Chloe the most wasn't the fireworks themselves. It was the way they glowed. Faintly but unmistakably, there was a soft, pulsing light emanating from the crate. She took a cautious step forward, reaching out to touch one of the fireworks. The moment her fingers brushed the cool surface, a shiver ran down her spine, and the room seemed to grow colder. A voice echoed in her head. "It's too late now. The past cannot be forgotten." Chloe jerked her hand back, her heart racing. The voice was faint, but it was there, deep and resonant, like the sound of distant thunder. She turned quickly to leave, but the attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Panicking, Chloe grabbed the doorknob and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. The air around her grew thick and heavy, the dim light of the attic flickering as though something was coming alive in the shadows. She turned back toward the crate, her pulse quickening, and that's when she saw it. The fireworks, suddenly, one by one, began to ignite. The first one exploded with a sharp crack, sending a burst of brilliant, sickly green light across the room. Chloe screamed, falling backward into the dust-covered furniture. The flames leaped from the fireworks, swirling in the air like a twisted dance. But there was no sound, no popping, no hissing, only the eerie glow of unnatural flames filling the room, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to move on their own. Chloe scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in frantic gasps. She had to get out. She had to escape. But every time she turned toward the door, she saw it again. The strange symbols, carved into the crate, now glowing faintly, as though pulsing with an energy that was not of this world. "It's too late now." The voice was clearer this time, more distinct. Chloe's mind reeled. Who was speaking? Was it her imagination, or was something truly wrong with this house? The fireworks continued to burn in the corner of the room, their unnatural glow casting twisted, unsettling shapes along the walls. They had become more than just fireworks. They had become something else, something ancient, something that should never have been ignited. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Chloe whipped around, her breath caught in her throat. She saw him, a figure standing in the doorway, cloaked in darkness, his features obscured by the shadows. He was tall, his presence overwhelming, and though Chloe could not see his face, she could feel his gaze burning into her soul. He took a step forward. Chloe froze. "You've awakened the past," the voice spoke again, now coming from the figure in the doorway. The voice was colder now, and the words felt like a warning. The fireworks were never meant to be lit. They carry the memories of those long forgotten. The figure stepped closer, his outline becoming clearer, revealing his skeletal frame. His skin was gray and withered, his eyes hollow voids that seemed to stare through her very soul. "Now, you will remember." And with that, the fireworks began to ignite once more, one after the other. filling the attic with a blinding, suffocating light. But as the flames raged, they began to shape into something more horrifying. Faces twisting in agony appeared within the flames. Chloe's mind shattered. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. As the clock struck the new year downstairs, the last firework exploded, engulfing the room in an impossible burst of light. And in that final, deafening silence, Chloe disappeared. Her family found the attic empty the next morning. No trace of her remained. Only the crate, now extinguished, the symbols carved into the wood faded and dark. But if you listen carefully on the quietest nights, when the wind howls through the trees, you might hear the faint sound of fireworks in the distance, an echo of something forgotten, something that should never have been remembered. And if you're unlucky enough to wander too close, you might find yourself drawn to that same farmhouse, to the attic where the fireworks of the forgotten still burn. And if you're even unluckier, you'll find that you can't leave. The fireworks are waiting,